The death of Samora Moses Machel angered not only the people of Mozambique but also throughout the surrounding countries. In South Africa, protesters blamed their government for Machel's death, while in Zimbabwe, thousands of youths stormed through downtown Harare. Samora Machel, born on 29 September 1933, was a Mozambican military commander and also a political leader, a socialist in the tradition of Marxism and Leninism. Samora served as the first president of Mozambique in the country's independence in 1975. He died in office when his presidential aircraft suspiciously crashed near Mbuzini in South Africa on that fateful day in the history of Mozambique and Africa as a whole, 19 October 1986. Until today, the truth about his plane crash remains one of the top secrets of both Mozambican government and South Africa, a territory where the accident occurred. History being the only study out of all the studies that we get from this world, proven to be the best rewarder of our research. African Eyes Media took some time looking into the history pages to understand the events that happened days before and also days after the accident in an effort to find the truth surrounding the death of this charismatic African leader, Samora Machel. So today, we want to spend some time analyzing some of the suspicious events that happened before and after the crash of the presidential plane, statements from the eyewitnesses, and also Mike, the only civilian present at the accident scene soon after the plane crash. Decoding 1910-86 Samora Machel's plane crash. Stay with me. I am the African teacher on African Eyes Media. According to Deborah Pater, News and Special Assignments Editor of Radio 702 in Ketok, who wrote that there was a motive for the then South African government to kill Mozambique's Samora Machel, and there is enough evidence to back up these claims. Robert Kilby, in his article titled The Samora Machel Crash, wrote, if South Africa in 1986 was a perfectly normal society with a judicial system above reproach and a defense force that would never stoop to dirty tricks, those at the receiving end of the apartheid's evil deeds need no convincing as to what this country's former rulers were capable of. End of quote. The then government of South Africa was perfectly capable of killing Mozambican President Samora Machel, and in fact it had tried on several occasions to assassinate him. Furthermore, the South African Defense Force was equipped with sophisticated beacon equipment that was part of its covert operations used during the Angolan War. But what was the gain by killing Samora Machel? South Africa lost a neighbor of imagination, purpose and optimism. With the Nkomati Accord signed, a new chapter of cooperation was opened. In terms of the Nkomati Accord, the African National Congress was unceremoniously booted out of Mozambique, and South Africa agreed to stop all military and logistical support for the rebel Mozambican group Renamo. But what does history tell us about the Nkomati Accord? Well, in this accord, Samora Machel entered into an agreement with the devil that made him to sign the Nkomati Accord, what many would argue was his own death warrant. In this agreement, South Africa had no intention of living up to this accord. Even though leaders of these two countries were shaking hands, supplies of weapons and rations were still being flown to Renamo. Even though leaders of the two countries were smiling at each other, Pretoria was beefing up its Casabanana base in Gorongosa. And when the Casabanana was captured by Frelimo a year after the accord, documents left behind showed that Machel had been cheated. Supplies continued to be thrown into the base. An airstrip was constructed, and one of its most frequent visitors was South Africa's Deputy Foreign Minister, Louis Nel. Even though leaders of these two countries signed an accord, South Africa initiated Renamo operations base in Malawi with the help of Kamuzubanda, which became a focal point for Frelimo destabilization. This forced Machel himself, Zambia's Kenneth Kaunda, and Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe to visit Blantyre and meet Banda on September 11, 1986, 30 days before the plane crash. In his book, Machel of Mozambique, Ian Christie writes, when Machel set out on the trip, he was angry. He detested Malawi President Hastings Banda and had on several occasions described him as a fascist. During a 2-hour meeting, a furious Machel presented to Banda under evidence of active support for Renamo by Malawi and South Africa. A photocopy of a Malawian passport issued to Renamo leader Alfonso Dhlakama was also part of the evidence. Machel threatened to place missiles along the border with Malawi if support to the bandits is not ended. He told journalists in the press conference on his return to Maputo from Blantyre that he will also close the border to traffic between Malawi and South Africa going through Mozambique, and that became a serious threat to South Africa and Malawi, for at that particular time an average of 70 trucks a day were passing through Tete province in Mozambique on the international route to the ports of South Africa. Shortly after Samora's meeting with Malawi's president, Renamo launched a three-pronged conventional military invasion of Mozambique from Malawi, with white soldiers believed to be members of the South African Special Forces leading the invasion. During a visit to the province of Tete, which borders with Malawi, Samora publicly said, "The Malawian authorities have made their country a base for mercenaries of various nationalities, but principally South African soldiers. I think President Banda is not responsible. I think ministers, soldiers, members of the police and the Malawian security have been bought by the South Africans and other countries. I don't want to name them now, although there is evidence of this." Machel was planning to fire several of his generals for profiting from the war with Renamo, but never lived to carry this out. On October 6, 1986, General Magnus Andre de Merindo Malan, who was the Minister of Defense and also Chief of South African Defense Force and South African Army during the presidency of Pieter Botha, threatened Machel personally following an alleged landmine explosion near the area where Machel's plane would crash 13 days later. In his words, General Malan quoted as saying, "If President Machel chooses landmines, South Africa will react accordingly. If he will allow Moscow-inspired revolutionary war against South Africa, he must also be prepared to take responsibility. If he chooses terrorism and revolution, he will clash head-on with South Africa." And so it was October 19 on a dark still night in Mbozini, a Tupolev 134 crashed into hilly terrain, killing Machel and 34 others. Only 9 people survived the accident. A local resident, one of the first people on the scene of the crash site, whom in fear for his safety only gave us his name as Mike, was taken to the scene of the crash by local police to help them negotiate with the mountainous terrain due to the knowledge of the area he had. To his surprise, he found security police already on the scene, with the injured passengers crying and mourning. The plane wreckage was scattered all over, and him being the only civilian at the scene. According to Mike, nobody seemed particularly concerned about providing much needed medical assistance. Instead, police combed through wreckage, demanding that survivors should tell them where Samora Machel was. Mike also witnessed the officers discovering the briefcase from the wreckages, which was thoroughly searched. The next day, Mike was forced to go into hiding because South African Defense Force soldiers repeatedly visited his home looking for him. A crash survivor, Samora's chief bodyguard Fernando Manuel Joao, who walked a considerable distance in search for help around midnight, managed to contact the Komatipo police through the radio of a local religious mission, echoes Mike's words. He said when he returned to the crash site, he found that the South Africans were not at all concerned with the lives of the wounded, and he was furious with the South Africans for refusing to take the wounded to the hospital. The then Foreign Affairs Minister Pieter Botha later admitted documents had been removed from the wreckage, providing details of a planned Mozambican strike against Malawi. Botha says, yes, technically that would have been a violation of diplomatic practice, certainly, but this was done probably to find out what was being discussed. But with respect, this has nothing to do with the crash or the causes of the crash. A statement that can give us a hint that Samora Machel was killed by the then South African apartheid government. In the days and weeks that followed the accident, there was much political posturing between South Africa and the Soviet Union due to the allegations that the Russian crew members who were in the plane were drunk and that could have been the possible cause of the accident. An agreement was then reached that the accident investigators would fly to the Soviet Union to listen to the black box in the presence of their Russian counterparts. But Mr. Lynch says literally days before they were due to fly to Moscow, police forensics were still refusing to part with the precious evidence, the black box. In love for our charismatic president, a team of journalists traveled to Italy to meet Umberto Fusarori Casadei. Casadei was just 16 years old when he was forced to watch his father and two uncles being publicly persecuted by Franco Mussolini's fascists during World War II in the northern Italy. This scared him for life, and he vowed then to fight oppression in every corner of the globe. It was this that led him to Samora Machel and joined the fight against the Portuguese. After Mozambique's independence, he became one of Machel's most trusted lieutenants operating in the dangerous world of counter-espionage. Casadei was a double agent pretending to work for South African military intelligence while secretly passing crucial information direct to Machel. He was paid 600 rand a month by South Africa for his false reports, money that ironically went straight into Mozambican government coffers. One of his regular contacts was a female agent whom he has identified but asked that we call Maureen. It was during a routine meeting with Maureen that Casadei stumbled on the information that South African and Mozambican agents were plotting to kill Machel and take over power in Maputo. After having knowledge of the identities of the Mozambican officials planning on betraying their leader, Casadei went straight to Machel and begged him to let him kill the two generals. Not long after this, the crash occurred. Devastated by the loss of one of his dearest friends, Casadei dedicated himself to investigating the cause of the crash. By 1994, he had collected enough information to go public with his story, speaking out in Mozambican radio interviews and newspaper articles. He linked top Mozambican and South African government officials to the conspiracy to kill Machel and provided critical technical information. A heavy price for his courage followed him. Assassins opened fire on him on two occasions, the first time convinced that they had killed him, but he survived, drove himself badly wounded to the hospital. Several months later, another round of bullets was emptied into Casadei's body, and again miraculously he survived, and this forced him to flee Mozambique and return to the town of his birth in northern Italy. Casadei's story is reinforced by a foreign intelligence document from a neighboring country. The document names the Malawian, Mozambican and South African agents who conspired in the plot to kill Machel. The Mozambicans named in the documents are the very same ones who sent assassins to kill Casadei. In this assassination plot, South African military intelligence was given the task of recruiting an airport official from Mozambique. According to the report, the airport official was paid a total of 1.5 million rands to assist the South Africans by switching off the Maputo radar system or the beacon. The report states that this person traveled to Zimbabwe to close the deal with his foreign counterparts with the help of a Mozambican official who got him a medical certificate to justify his absence. Payments were made in two parts. After the deal, the Malawians and the South Africans started to monitor the control tower and the communications in it. The airport official would later ensure that the Maputo beacon and radar system were switched off, making it easier to operate a decoy beacon transmitting a signal on the same wavelength as the Maputo beacon. The report states that on the night of the accident, a decoy beacon was used to divert the plane off course. The weather was extremely cloudy in Mbuzini that night, which provided optimum conditions for a decoy beacon to work successfully. The document also claims that South African special forces were in Mbuzini on the night of the accident. A former 32 battalion member who was on duty along the other part of the border on that night of the Machel crash stumbled on the presence of soldiers in Mbuzini while he was monitoring his frequency hopping radio. That night he said he was a member of the special forces which was actively busy with another operation and using a C-21 military radio. We heard pieces of messages coming through from one Resi, which is the 1st Parachute Battalion of the South African Defence Force, in the vicinity of the place where the plane went down of Samora Machel. No mention was made over the radio of the nature of the Special Force operation. The soldier revealed that a blackout of information always meant it was a black op, which is a highly secret operation, details of which would only be known at a presidential and senior general level. Another former national national serviceman based at military headquarters in Pretoria, came forward to say on the night of the crash he was told he had to work late. His job was to provide refreshments for the military top brass led by General Schubert Kurt Liebenberg and Magnus Malan, who arrived at the headquarters the night of the plane crash. It was unusual because we had to work late and take refreshments up to them, and these guys had an appetite, they were hungry, said the national serviceman, who did not want his name to be disclosed, and says by some strange coincidence there was a secret operation underway that night. Also there that night was former electronic warfare head Lieutenant Colonel Mosi Basson, who confirmed the presence of Jobert and says that by some strange coincidence there was a secret operation underway that night. However, he says it had nothing to do with the Machel plane crash. Of course, African Eyes puts a question mark onto that. The South African Air Force admitted it was tracking the Russian aircraft on its radar system that night and saw the plane making a wrong turn. One has to wonder why it never bothered to communicate with an enemy plane heading for South African territory. Surely the obvious thing to have done was to point out that the Russian plane had made a wrong turn and warn the pilot he was about to encroach on South African airspace. The Renamo and Special Forces link is given weight by another piece of evidence from former Renamo operative Paulo de Oliveira, who was based in Lisbon at the time. Several days before the crash, de Oliveira's South African military contact in Parabora sent him an urgent message saying, "Pay attention to the news and stay near the telephone," and so on, because something big is going to happen. That was 2 or 3 days before the crash. Several hours after the crash, de Oliveira received further orders telling him to remain on standby, as Renamo might have to claim responsibility for shooting down Machel's plane. By midday, the instruction had been withdrawn and the accident was never spoken about. De Oliveira handed himself over to Frelimo in 1988, and he provided details of South Africa's ongoing support for Renamo long after the Nkomati Accord had been signed. A senior military colonel now retired from the army has confirmed that there were also members of the Signal Intelligence Division in Mbuzini on the night of the crash. He describes a Land Rover that he says was in the area over the period of the crash under the command of the Signal Intelligence Division. Inside the vehicle was sophisticated electronic equipment used to unscramble frequencies, monitor signals, and this evidence was also confirmed by the residents in Mbuzini, who spoke of seeing a Land Rover in the area at the time of the crash. A former national serviceman in the Air Force working at Snake Barre 4AD says in the weeks preceding the Machel crash, he saw a beacon being built. He describes a piece of equipment powered by a Kawasaki motor mounted on a small trolley with a clay mast attached to it. When he asked why it was being built, he was told it's a secret operation that has nothing to do with him. It disappeared over the weekend of the crash. Casadei's allegations and the intelligence documents indicates that the Maputo beacon was indeed switched off. According to Casadei, ground control staff were removed from their posts shortly before the plane was due to land. The radar was not working, and it's possible that the Maputo beacon was also switched off. The plane crashed in South African territory, and South Africa was then able to control the accident investigation.